Shankar Lahiri, who we dearly called Shankar Da, is one of the most intriguing poetic voices that emerged from Bengal in the 80s. An engineer by profession, Lahiri's literary and artistic interests have always spread far and deep. He excelled not just in poetry, but also in creative nonfiction, filmmaking, and photography. A poet of the 80s, he has been actively associated with the cult Bengali little magazine Kourab as a member of its editorial board. He has so far authored 7 books of poems, 3 books of prose nonfiction, and has edited the complete works of Swadesh Sen. He also has so far directed 4 films inspired or based on poetry. Now retired professionally, Lahiri spends his time working on his craft of writing and filmmaking while also pursuing a myriad of other interests including photography, forest exploration, book designing, computer graphics, and the study of cosmology. And with all of that, he constantly aspires to curate his own universe full of endless possibilities. Dear poet Shankar Lahiri, thank you very much for participating in this 2023 edition of Gestures of Poetry, a digital literary event organized by the Universidad de los Andes from Colombia. This interview is conducted in partnership with the Antonym collections. To begin with, could you please tell us about your poetic vocation? When exactly did you start writing poetry, and which were your first influences?
Hi, greetings to you, Vishnu Priya, and thank you for your kind words. Well, let me take your first question. It actually casts the net wide, very wide. Well, in the beginning, let me put it this way. All that have influenced me and continue to influence my being and my poetry are linked to a lot of things, particularly my childhood, the memory images that I still carry, my growing up in a Bengali middle class family, its values, the people around, then my engagement with nature, beauty and wonders of forests, mountains, rivers, the sky above, the gorgeous clouds, cumulus, nimbus, deep space, deep sea soils, the color blue, and the awesome vastness of the universe that we are in. And also the myriad relationships that are forged and also destroyed in the living world every moment. All that have gone into oblivion, leaving faint marks in our soul that we are unable to read nor decipher. All these have cast a spell on me, influenced my thoughts, my poetry, and its unending search. Also important is the path that I have traversed so far. I was born in 1950 in Jamshedpur, in an indigenous village called Shakchi, which was surrounded by the Tata Steel plant on one side and the Dalma Hills and the Suvarnarekha River on the other. I am a Bengali by birth, and as you know, Bengalis normally start writing rhymes in childhood. So did I. My schooling was in Kolkata, where my father worked. We were a joint family with uncles, aunts, and cousins, living together in a rented house in Damdam. I studied in vernacular medium, that is Bengali. It is my mother tongue. Now, when I was in primary school, it was in the northern outskirts of Kolkata. I secretly started writing short poems, just a few lines that rhymed. It went on like that. and I used to read a lot of poems. My parents and uncles used to give me books of poems and stories on my birthday every year. These were written by Rabindranath Tagore, Satyen Datta, Sukumar Roy, Kazi Nazrul, and other famous poets, the rhymes written particularly for children. This created a huge personal space for me, a space full of imagination, fantasy, and also of worldly matters. Meter and rhythm phonetically got engraved inside, and very soon I learned to write rhymes. This sensitized my ears and helped me a lot. When I grew up, I was exposed to prose poems and soon discovered its inner rhythms too. But in my younger days, truly I never had the slightest idea of ever becoming a writer or a poet. My aim was to become an engineer. I have very fond memories of my childhood. But things abruptly changed around us in the mid 1960s. The joint family broke up. Uncles got married and went away to stay elsewhere. We became lonely. I took solace in the songs written by Tagore. I learned by rote about 300 of his songs, the songs that could be heard playing on gramophone records or radio in the houses of well-to-do neighbors. We were poor, could not afford to have a radio. I was not a loner, nor an introvert, neither an extrovert. I was selective and always wanted to rise above the mediocre. In fact, I disliked mediocrity. In my school days, I was attracted to poetry of the leftist writers. Those days I didn't have my own ideas, so I started writing poems like them. How silly. I scribbled lines that actually did not carry my own thoughts. In a short time, I even prepared a handwritten pencil and paper manuscript of about 20 poems. It was in free verse and named it Moshal, that is the torch. Then came my father's sudden death, all of a sudden, like a bolt from the blue. I was only 15-year-old, and this was a turning point in my life. I looked up in the sky. It was still so much blue, but our road ahead was dark. And I was still in school, high school. This was a turbulent time for us, our family of three, my mother, sister, and me. And the political scene was also warming up in Bengal. Future looked bleak. I stopped writing poetry and all such things. I was craving for fresh air, seeking a new landscape, seeking life elsewhere. I used to buy old magazines from footpath shops, old copies of the Time magazine, the National Geographic, Popular Mechanics, Popular Photography, and print albums of the master painters, Rembrandt, Picasso, Van Gogh, Claude Monet, Renoir, Paul Gauguin, Salvador Dali, and others. I was fascinated by reading about the life of nomads, the Red Indians, Chief Joseph, chased by the bear, and others. The Galapagos Island, the sand art of Vanuatu, the rituals of Mayas and Incas, the Hindu mythology, the Greek goddesses, all filled my inner world. All these were influencing my thoughts, my perspective, my personal search for beauty and peace. My grandfather was a village doctor, a doctor on horseback. He died many years before I was born. But I liked the story of his horse. It used to come in my dream. Horse became my favorite animal, not cow that is worshipped in our Hindu community. The wild horses of Mongolia, Kazakhstan. This is how I was creating my very own landscape. Its hue and texture, images and reflections, all that would influence my writings later. I passed from school, then joined college, studied mechanical engineering for 5 years, and became a first-class graduate engineer. My childhood dream finally came true. During college years, I came to know about Mao Zedong, Vladimir Lenin, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, the Vietnam War. I was excited to see the movie Fall of Berlin. The Holocaust movies gripped me. It haunted me for years. Maybe in my last birth, in my childhood, I too died in the gas chamber of the Auschwitz concentration camp, I thought. I was very sad to read the diary of Anne Frank. Many years later, I visited their ill-fated house turned museum in Amsterdam. After graduation from college, I got employed as a junior industrial engineer in Tata Steel, Jamshedpur. In 1973, I started earning. And thus our family of three was now back to the place where I was born, my maternal grandfather's house, the land of the Dalma Hills and the Suvarnarekha River. This was a turning point in my life. For if I got a job in Kolkata and stayed back and frequented the College Street coffee house where poets and intellectuals gathered and gossiped, my poetry would have been different, very different. It would have lost its identity. In fact, Tata Steel shaped me in many ways. It was indeed an experience to work in an integrated steel plant. Its mines, ports, huge stockyards. It opened a window on the world. Here I could feel the immense weight of earth, the terrifying power of gravitation, the huge earth-moving equipment, the huge bunkers, tall silos of minerals and ores, overland conveyors, the dark depth of the mines, roaring blast furnaces, steel melting shops, the overhead cranes carrying huge ladles of super-hot molten metal, and the large Panamax vessels berthing at the seaports. Enchanting workhorses, technology at its very best, I thought. This landscape was so much different from what the city life at Kolkata could offer to a poet. After joining Tata Steel, I had to go through several training programs. And the subjects that fascinated me most were awareness and intuition, creativity and dream analysis, operations research, simulation modeling, chaos theory, etc. It opened a new horizon for me, shaped my thought processes. I was slowly coming to understand how the gigantic dynamo of the world turns. Contemporary Bengali poetry did not impress me. I found it stale, repetitive, narrative, confessional. I came to know about Edward de Bono and read his books on the thought processes, linear and lateral thinking, rock logic and water logic, the self-organizing and patterning systems. It made me contemplate, why do we think the way we think? Why do we feel the way we feel? Why do we act the way we act? I was seeking answers to all this. Often in my dream, I used to see water falling from great height into a blue lagoon. She is sailing away in a small paper boat. I was still away from poetry, Instead, I was reading futuristic books on technology, cosmology, about the structure of the universe, etc. Books by Fritjof Capra, Stephen Hawking, Buckminster Fuller, Roger Penrose, Richard Dawkins, and others. None of them were poets, but they made reference to poetry. It made me look at life and poetry from different angles, from a new perspective. I realized that we need to modernize our mind, need to review our thought processes. Many years later, on my advice, Tata Steel adopted it as a corporate strategy. Modernization of mind. And cosmology fascinated me the most. I purchased a 70mm Newtonian reflector telescope and started stargazing. Planets, moons, comets, distant galaxies and constellations, the large Magellan Cloud and the Andromeda Nebula. Meanwhile, I was getting conversant with the writings of the post-Tagore Bengali poets. I bought and read some of their books that were being hailed, loved, and awarded in literary circles in Kolkata. But much of it didn't impress me. It was repetitive still. Much of it was rubbish. Why so many poets and so much poetry? Someone asked. To me, poetry is seeking, examining, understanding, and expressing the myriad relationships that this throbbing life in the cosmos has been built upon. The mind-blowing labyrinth of bonds and connections between every being, every atom, every quark that is a part of the cosmos. All of us are sort of structurally coupled. Only a few poets gripped my attention. They were Jivanananda Das, Utpal Kumar Bose, Swadesh Sen, and Binoy Mojumdar. Born in 1934, Binoy was an engineer and a renowned mathematician. The film that I am now making is on the life and poetics of this poet. This was the time I started thinking about writing poetry seriously. I searched for poets in Jamshedpur and came to know about a group of poets named Gaurav. Although their magazine was quite famous in Kolkata circles, the group lost its steam and was about to wind up. They smelled some fresh air in me and I was fondly welcomed into the group. This was early 1978. We started our poetry camps in the forests, away from the city. We went to the seashores. There we read poetry, discussed poetry, dreamed poetry in our camps. I was in charge of recording the sessions, which were later published and became very popular. In a few years, I managed to read a lot of European and American poets. Reading T.S. Eliot and Charles Baudelaire was a great experience. French poetry fascinated me. And then I seriously sat down to write, both prose and poetry, in 1980. And these were being mostly published in the Gaurav magazine. Films and paintings sparked my imagination. Filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein's montage technique, painter Bosch's illustration of hell, these have influenced my poetry. And also mathematics. I have drawn from many such sources. As a writer in making, my model was observe 40, think 30, read 20, write 6, publish 4. That was it, which I still follow.
In your poems, it seems that there is a coming and going between the contemplation of everyday life and a mystical or unspeakable experience. This is how it feels in poems like Coffee or Wall and the Bed, or even in The Color of Poetry. Do you think this appreciation is correct?
Yes, it's a way of expression. It comes from my living, my awake self, the acquired self, and the buried self. My poetry plays through these strata, seeking to connect with the cosmos, an awareness of eternity. My soul is not shackled. I am a part of the whole that is unbound, open on all sides. In the center of my writing, there is a hint of this open-endedness. You consider those lines in the poem Coffee. I read, gradually from the depth of the cup, a strong flavor rises and permeates the embryo, and resonates in lips, in wombs, in myriad wings. Then the lines from the poem Wall and Bed. I read, defeat or a vulnerable antlered deer, wall or a sense of collapse, marriage proposal or walk with the crutches, step by step, all the way to the icy wall, to the bed bestrewn with thorns. And the third poem you mentioned was Color of Poetry. Let me quote from that. Suddenly I am struck by a gust of wind. Perhaps some boatmen weighed the anchor. I rolled and rocked and saw you too, rocking, new poetry, blurred and obscure, swinging, leaning in an eagerness to touch. Your hair is undone, your blouse is unbuttoned. These poems were written by me in the 1980s, about 35 years back.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about how a new poem arises for you and what kind of experiences lead you to write it?
Mind is always awake, and awareness is enough. Even when I am asleep, a different kind of consciousness is still awake at the deeper levels. The mechanism of our brain, the neural network, is fascinating. How the thing called intuition works, how the memories are filed in the brain's archive, how they are interlinked, tagged, or flagged, how incredibly fast these are computed, how they are triggered to rise from the darkest depths of mind and ring a bell as they surface. While writing poetry, I am driven by experiences that are holistic, and it takes effort to connect and write. My deep-rooted memory images, or is it my inner being touched by gravity waves from distant space? Difficult to say how it comes. All such things could create the sparks. I not only write in words, I also use several mediums, light, sound, music. That is how I express myself in cinema. You may call them poetry films or poe films. I call them tantrochitra. It's a new genre. I am aware of certain strong images that keep haunting me. An intense reader can find those scattered in many of my poems. These are fruit bowl, harpoon, a ship's anchor, old iron trunk, moss and jellyfish, old parchment, primordial salt, black granite, wild horses, glacier, wound and bandage, photons and ions, burnt orchard, bronze wings, coil spring, brine water, radioactive flesh, empty coffee tin, coffin, sound of weeping, a pomegranate tree that has gone mad, and many more. I had listed them in the last page of my first book of poems in 1990. I never sit down to write a poetry just on the spur of something happening around in the present tense, a flash flood or a road accident, or gender discrimination, or fuel price rise, etc. My poetry is not for raising slogans, nor for protest marches. There are hundreds of well-named, well-awarded, popular poets for such things. Visibly, they enjoy much larger readership.
Shankar, could you tell us about your poem Tomorrow? This one catches my attention especially because of its somewhat bleak and perhaps even apocalyptic tone. Does this poem express a conception of yours about the near future of humanity?
Yes, as you rightly caught the tone, in the poem Tomorrow, there is a cold, fluid fear that percolates deep down, some kind of helpless, mute observation about the future, about all that essentially weave the very fabric of our existence. In the long term, the sun in the sky that provides us with energy and keeps us in our orbit would die as all stars die eventually. And this planet called Earth would also die because of that. But in the short term, enough of damage has already been done to the planet that we inhabit. Yet, as the Gaia hypothesis tells us, I do hope that it will survive. It is still not beyond the scope of self-regulating and self-healing. It has that power, unless it crosses the tipping point, the point of no return. And when the time runs out, no poetry would save us. I quote the last few lines of my poem, Tomorrow, about the fear. A black and enormous sun would rise again. Wastewater, mixed with fear and salt, would inundate the entire garden.
Being a poet, you are also a film director and screenwriter. So, how is your poetic craft intertwined with the audiovisual media? Is it different? Is it something of a cohabitation of different kinds of inspirations and perceptions? Can you talk about that?
All art forms have something in common. That is the artistic sense. The language of poetry and language of cinema are somewhat different because of their dimensions. Both have advantages and disadvantages in crafting an expression or communicating an idea. Certain film techniques are used in poetry too. The abrupt cuts, the overlaps, the interludes, use of symbols, the montage effect, etc. I enjoy making documentary films, and I like it to transcend beyond the use of documentation. I call them Tantra. My favorite directors are Jean-Luc Godard, Werner Herzog, Tarkovsky, Paolo Pasolini, Abbas Kiarostami, Bergman, Bartolucci, Sergei Parayanov, and many others who have inspired me and ignited my poetic imagination. According to Andrei Tarkovsky, the aim of art is to prepare a person for death. I noted it in my diary.
I have translated your creative non-fiction piece, This Heart, The Sinking Depths, which is a 9-part essay that talks about a life and many deeper, obscure truths and perceptions around it. As a translator, when I was attempting it, I was blown over by its poetic beauty and also how experimental it was in the way every sentence was crafted, how in their lyricism and in their organization of images and the poetic, the prose voice that came out. So I always wanted to ask you this, that you have been writing prose for probably as long as you have been crafting poetry. And I'm not even sure how to correctly define your kind of prose. which time and again it impresses one as not just deeply lyrical and poetic, but also experimental, and while being very very aware of their economic social context, um, and also woke in many many respects. Would you like to share your thoughts on this? What inspires your prose, the kind that you keep on writing?
Thank you, Vishnu Priya, for your appreciation. Your translation of my prose has been wonderful. Yes, my writings are experimental. It examines life and poetry itself. After joining the Kaurav group in 1978, I spent a lot of time learning to write prose. That would be my own prose, which would have a well crafted syntax, would be fluid, lucid, textured, and layered to delicately carry the ideas. It would thus carry my own style and signature, I thought. This parallelly helped me in writing poetry. This craft is the individual hallmark of a creative writer. It carries the essence of one's inner world, the buried self. It is therefore individualistic, difficult to be copied by others. And the images are drawn from deep inside our tiered consciousness. It is for us, my other self, my anima, as Carl Gustav Jung called it, that keeps talking to me silently all the while. That is a space where I truly live, beyond the laws of physics, beyond the Euclidean geometry. But it constantly draws its resources from the real world of brick and mortar, of heat and dust, of corrosion and rust. Working in such zone, one cannot be a prolific writer. It needs restraint, because so much has been written and said by millions of writers and poets in the last 20 millennium. There is nothing more to say, except for rebuilding the buried images, bring them to light, examine, and remain awestruck in silence. My first prose was Motorhome, published in Kaurav in 1981. It was about a fantasy journey of a group of poets and artists in a caravan, which became enormously popular. The magazine received mails in appreciation. In the same year, I wrote my first anti-narrative story, Ah, Those Tricycles. This was published 3 times in the same magazine in the following years. Although many readers found it amusingly obscure. The editor of Kaurav mentioned that the prose piece was Martian in its skill and style. I was a bit confused and decided to send the prose piece really to Mars someday. Many years later, the opportunity came in 2020. NASA agreed to send the title of my prose, Ah, Those Tricycles, to Mars, along with many other names sent by Mars enthusiasts. The title was etched with laser beam on the body of the spaceship Perseverance that actually landed on Mars in February 2021 in the Jezero crater, and it is still there. NASA also sent me a boarding pass for the title's journey to Mars. This is inspiring also. Well, this is just on the lighter side of the question you asked.
Finally, what does the expression gestures of poetry suggest to you?
Yeah, the name of my first book of poems, published in 1990, was Shoriri Kobita in Bengali. In English, it could be body poetry. Poetry carries us, illuminates us, touches us, and does make unspoken gestures that may be easy to understand, or at times appear to be obscure, ambiguous to the reader. So gestures of poetry fits quite well. I like it. Poetry can communicate through gestures before it is understood. It reminds of the Chilean-French avant-garde filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky. In his film Endless Poetry, it is said, "Poetry is the luminous excrement of a toad that swallowed a firefly." I think I have finished answering all your beautifully provoking questions. At least I tried my best. Thank you so much for this interview and for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear poet, for participating in Gestos de la Poesía 2023. We recommend the audience to read Shankar Lahiri's poems in the digital anthology that is now available on the Poetry Gestures website. Thank you very much. This interview is conducted in partnership with the Antonym Collections, India.